The morning Daniel Carter fixed a stranger's transmission for $40. He told himself it was enough. It had to be. The rent was 3 weeks late. The roof above Lily's bedroom had started leaking again in 2 places, and the collection notice from Riverside General Hospital had been sitting on the kitchen counter so long that the ink had faded at the creases where he'd folded and unfolded it so many times. $40. He tucked the bills into his chest pocket, thanked the man, and drove his rusted white van back down the county road toward home, watching the October sky go gray above the pines. He was 38 years old, and he was tired in the kind of way that sleep couldn't fix. But when he pulled into the gravel driveway and heard Lily calling his name from the porch, something in his chest loosened just enough to let him breathe. Daniel Carter had not always been this kind of man, the kind who counted quarters on a Tuesday, who wore the same pair of work boots 3 seasons running because he couldn't justify the $45 for a new pair. He had been a good mechanic once, the kind other mechanics called when they were stumped. He had been a husband. He had been for 7 years. The man who kissed Sarah goodbye every morning and believed, without question, that the future was something being built toward. Then the diagnosis came. Then the treatments. Then the bills. Then the silence. Sarah died on a Thursday in late February, 6 years ago, and the world didn't stop, it just kept moving and left Daniel standing at the edge of it, holding an 8-year-old girl who smelled like her mother's shampoo and didn't fully understand that the word gone was permanent. He sold what he could. He kept what mattered. He learned to cook 3 things well, and to make Lily laugh at dinner, even on nights when there wasn't quite enough on either of their plates. Lily was 8 now, with Sarah's dark eyes and Daniel's stubbornness, and she had a habit of drawing in the margins of everything her homework, the paper bags from the grocery store, the backs of envelopes that came in the mail. She drew cars, mostly. Sleek, impossible cars with fins and chrome grills and lines that curved like music. She had never sat in anything newer than Daniel's van, had never felt leather seats or heard the quiet hum of a real engine, but she drew those cars the way other children drew castles, like she believed in them completely. She kept a binder full of them under her bed. Sometimes Daniel would find her asleep over a new sketch, her pencil still in her hand, and he would pull the blanket up over her shoulders and sit there in the dark for a while, wondering what kind of world he was preparing her for and whether he was doing it right. The notice from Hargrove National Bank arrived on a Friday. 30 days to resolve the default or the property would enter foreclosure proceedings. Daniel read it twice, then set it beside the hospital letter on the counter, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard where Lily's bicycle leaned against the fence. The rear tire was flat. He hadn't had time to fix it. He added it to the list he kept in his head, the list that never got shorter, only longer, only heavier. That night, after Lily was asleep, he sat at the table with his laptop open and searched for any work within 20 miles. Odd jobs. Estate sales. Cleanouts. And that was when he found the listing. A property management company in Caldwell needed someone to begin preliminary clearing of an abandoned estate on Whitmore Road. Cash payment on completion. The address was a place called the Hargrove House, an old Georgian manor that had been sitting empty for over 2 decades. No one local ever talked about it directly. They talked around it the way people talked around old grief. He told Lily over breakfast that he had a job for the week. She looked up from her cereal and asked if it was far. He said no, just out past the old mill. She nodded and went back to her drawing a new car, this one with a long hood and narrow headlights, something European in its bones. He kissed the top of her head on the way out. The rain had started again by the time he reached Whitmore Road. And when the manor appeared through the tree line, gray and enormous against the wet sky, Daniel felt something he couldn't name, not fear exactly, but a kind of awareness, the way the air changes pressure before a storm. He parked the van, put on his headlamp, and went to work. The first 2 days were ordinary. He cleared brush from the front approach, cataloged the contents of the ground floor rooms, removed water-damaged materials from the back hallway. The house was cold and smelled of damp plaster and something older beneath it, cedar, maybe, or old leather. On the third day, while clearing the utility room beside the kitchen, Daniel noticed the floor. The tiles near the far wall were slightly different, newer, or at least laid differently, the grout lines too precise against the older, irregular work surrounding them. He moved a heavy steel shelving unit aside, and behind it was a door. Steel-framed, recessed into the wall, a heavy mechanical lock, the kind that hadn't been manufactured in 20 years. He stood there with his headlamp pointed at it for a long moment. Then he went back to his van for his tools. It took him the better part of an hour to work the lock open without destroying the mechanism. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed with rust, and the smell that came out was different from the rest of the house, cool, dry, almost sealed. He aimed his light down the stairs. Stone steps, carved from the earth itself, leading to a room below. He went down slowly, one hand on the wall, and then he stopped. In the center of the underground space, draped in canvas tarps the color of old cream, sat something enormous. Something shaped like an answer to every drawing his daughter had ever made. He pulled the first tarp from the front, and the chrome came up out of the darkness like something surfacing from a dream. A long hood, narrow headlights, recessed into a face that was angular and deliberate, German in its precision. The second tarp came away, and he saw the body a deep charcoal color beneath the dust. The kind of color that wasn't black, but became black in shadow. A BMW, old enough to be rare, young enough to still be recognizable. The kind of car that belonged behind glass, in a climate-controlled room, not under a stone floor in a forgotten estate. He stood back and looked at it. Both of his hands had gone still at his sides. He circled it once, slowly, without touching it. The dust on the exterior was uniform, deep and layered. The accumulation of years, not months. The tires had deflated completely. The rubber dried and cracked at the sidewalls. There was no visible body damage, no rust breaking through the paint, no shattered glass. Whoever had put this car down here had cared about it, had prepared it. The canvas tarps had been weighted at the corners with old bricks. A dehumidifier, long dead, sat against the wall. A work light on a stand had been left hanging from a hook in the ceiling. This wasn't abandonment. This was preservation. He found the photograph tucked under the windshield wiper on the driver's side, sealed inside a plastic sleeve that had kept it nearly perfect. A man, maybe 50, standing beside the car in what appeared to be summer-rolled sleeves, a slight smile that wasn't quite a smile, the kind of look that belonged to someone who had just finished something difficult and wasn't yet sure how to feel about it. The car behind him was clean, gleaming, alive. Daniel turned the photograph over. On the back, in a precise hand, "If you find this, know that I was never anything but proud." No date. No name beyond the single initial. The journal was in the glove compartment, leather-bound, its cover warped slightly from humidity despite the care taken to preserve the space. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same careful hand as the note on the photograph. He skimmed the early page's technical notes, engine observations, dates and measurements, and then near the back, the tone changed. Shorter entries. Tighter. The last entry was only 2 lines. He read it twice. "Do not let Evelyn find this car. Not until she's ready to know what I built and why I had to hide it." He looked up from the journal into the dark. The car sat there in his headlamp light. Patient. Enormous. Utterly still. He was reaching for the door handle when the electrical system woke up. It happened without warning. A low hum, a flicker, and then the dashboard lit up behind the dusty glass, like something coming alive after a long sleep. Warning lights cycling. The clock on the instrument panel showed a time that had stopped 22 years ago. The ambient light in the car's interior came on, weak and orange, like a candle behind thick paper. Daniel stepped back. His heart was going fast. The car hadn't moved, the engine hadn't turned, but something in it had recognized that someone was there, and it had opened its eyes. He was still standing in the driveway of the manor at 6:15 the next morning when the black cars arrived. 3 of them, large and quiet, rolling up the gravel approach in a single line like a cortege. They stopped at the top of the drive. The doors opened. 4 men in dark coats stepped out first, taking positions without being asked, which told Daniel everything he needed to know about what kind of person was about to emerge from the vehicle. She came out of the center car last. Tall, angular, dressed in charcoal wool that matched the October sky. Her hair was dark and pulled back with a severity that looked like a decision rather than a habit. She walked toward him with the measured pace of someone who had never once been uncertain of her destination. Evelyn Black was 44 years old and worth, by last published estimate, somewhere north of $3.7 billion. She had built Black Automotive Technologies from a single patent filed in her mid-20s into one of the most influential engineering firms in the country, and she had done it by being the most unforgiving person in every room she entered. Industry profiles used words like ruthless and exacting. Competitors used words that didn't belong in print. She had been interviewed in major business publications more times than she could count. And in every photograph, she looked like someone who had decided long ago that warmth was a luxury she couldn't afford. She stopped 5 feet from Daniel and looked at him with pale gray eyes that were measuring and expressionless. "This is private property," she said. Her voice was even, the kind of even that takes years to practice. "You'll want to collect your equipment and leave." Daniel told her he'd been hired by the property management company. She looked past him at the manor's front door, which he'd left propped open, and something shifted in her face barely. Almost nothing, but he saw it. She asked the name of the company. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then one of the men beside her said something in a low voice, and she turned and looked at him. And whatever silent communication passed between them made her jaw tighten. She turned back to Daniel. "Have you been inside?" He told her he had. He told her about the door in the utility room. He told her about the stairs. He watched her face the entire time, and when he said the word basement, something cracked open behind her eyes, just for a second, before she sealed it back shut. She walked past him without another word. He followed, because it was that kind of morning. She went down the stone steps with her coat still on, one hand trailing the wall. When she saw the car, she stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom and stood there without moving. The 4 men stayed at the top of the stairs. Daniel stood to her right. The BMW sat there in its stillness, the dashboard's ambient glow still faintly visible through the dusted glass. For a long moment, Evelyn Black said absolutely nothing. Then, almost without volume, "He kept it." Daniel didn't ask who. He didn't need to. She told him eventually, after she'd walked the entire perimeter of the car twice without touching it, that the car had belonged to her father, Robert Black, an engineer, a visionary, a man who had spent the last years of his life working on something he believed would change the way engines were built. 22 years ago, he had walked out of his own company and never come back. No note. No explanation. No body ever found. The official story, the story the press had run with, the story the company's board had released, was that Robert Black had suffered a mental collapse and disappeared. Evelyn had been 22. She had spent the years since building her own empire, which meant spending years building something to fill the shape of the thing he'd left behind. She had never spoken publicly about her father. She had never, as far as anyone knew, looked for him. That was when Daniel, almost without meaning to, picked up the wrench he'd set on the stone floor the night before and reached under the hood. He hadn't planned it. His hands just moved. The way hands do when a mechanic sees something out of alignment, a loose connection, a corroded terminal, an obvious fix presenting itself. He reseated the positive cable to the battery and pressed on the ground terminal until it clicked. The dashboard lit up full. The climate system tried to cycle, and from somewhere deep inside the engine block, something rotated. Just once, just barely. But it rotated. The sound it made was not an engine sound. It was barely a sound at all. But in the silence of that underground room, it was enormous. Evelyn looked at Daniel. Her expression had changed in a way that was difficult to describe. Not softer, exactly, but stunned. like something she had expected to remain closed had opened. She looked at his hands, then back at the car. "How many engineers have I had look at this vehicle?" she said quietly, and none of them, not one, made it move. She paused. "And you did it with dirty hands." Daniel looked at her. He wiped his hands on his work pants and said nothing. She stood up straighter. The mask came back, the precision and the distance. She looked at the car for a long time. Then she looked at him. "If you can make it run," she said. "I will give you $10 million. He said yes. He said yes before she finished the sentence, which was the kind of decision a man makes not with his head but with a vision of a particular foreclosure notice and a little girl with flat bicycle tires. He said yes, and then the reality of what he'd agreed to arrived like cold water. The terms were simple and brutal. The car could not leave the property. He would be given access to the manor's outbuilding as a workspace. He would have 30 days. If the car truly ran, engine turning, all systems functional, the $10 million was his. If it didn't, he left with nothing and waived any claim to payment for the days he'd already worked. Standard legal documents, drawn up and delivered to the manor by noon the following day. He signed them without a lawyer because he didn't have one. The first coverage appeared online within 48 hours. Someone on the property management company's end had talked, and by the time the story reached the regional news, it had taken on the shape that stories like this always take. A broke mechanic, a billionaire, an impossible bet. The word stunt appeared in every headline. One columnist called it the most elaborate charity publicity exercise she'd seen in years. A former colleague of Evelyn's, quoted anonymously, said the whole thing was designed to generate goodwill for a company struggling with its public image. No one, in any of the coverage, suggested that Daniel Carter would actually succeed. They debated the exact nature of his failure. They placed informal odds. They used phrases like charming but misguided and well-meaning but clearly out of his depth. Daniel read one article and then stopped reading them. He had 30 days and a car that hadn't run in 22 years and a journal full of handwritten engineering notes that were brilliant and incomplete in equal measure. He set up in the outbuilding with his own tools and a work light and a folding table. And he started from the beginning, not from what he thought he knew, but from what the car actually was. He was methodical in the way that men become methodical when they can't afford to make mistakes. He documented everything, photographed everything, mapped the engine compartment the way he would have mapped an unfamiliar terrain. He slept 4 hours a night. He survived on coffee and sandwiches he made in the manor's kitchen, which Evelyn had unlocked for his use without comment. On the 5th night, Lily called him and asked when he was coming home. He told her soon. She told him she'd been staying with Mrs. Prentice next door, and that Mrs. Prentice made oatmeal wrong, which made him laugh for the first time in days. She asked if he was okay. He said he was fine. She was quiet for a second. And then she said, "I know you're going to fix it, Dad." "You fix everything." He sat in the empty outbuilding after they hung up, his hands flat on the cold work table, and let that sentence hold him up for a while. He had sold his watch to buy the first round of specialized parts, Sarah's watch, the one she'd given him on their 4th anniversary, the one with the inscription inside the case that he'd memorized so long ago he could feel the shape of the letters without looking. He'd gotten $430 for it at the shop on Clement Street. He didn't let himself think about it for long. There wasn't time. The real problem arrived on day 9. He'd known something was off from the beginning. The architecture of the engine didn't match any BMW designation he could identify, even after cross-referencing every technical document he could access. The displacement was wrong. The component layout was wrong. The fuel system configuration was unlike anything he'd seen in production engineering. He spent an entire night with the journal open beside the engine bay, matching Robert Black's handwritten diagrams to what he was seeing in front of him, and by 3 in the morning he understood what he was looking at. This was not a standard engine. This was not even a modified standard engine. It was something else entirely. Robert Black had spent 4 years designing it. The journal made that clear, reading through the earlier sections that Daniel had initially skipped 4 years of iterations, failures, recalculations, 4 years of late nights and scrapped prototypes and fights with the company's board over budget and priority. What he had built, in the end, was an internal combustion engine that operated on a fundamentally different fuel-to-compression ratio than anything currently on the market, using a valve timing system of his own design that allowed it to extract nearly 40% more energy from the same volume of fuel. In practical terms, what this meant was simple. A car equipped with this engine could go roughly twice as far on the same tank. In 1994, Robert Black had designed an engine that would have cut fuel consumption in half for an entire industry. And then, it had vanished into the ground. Daniel sat with that knowledge for a long time. He thought about what it meant. He thought about who would want it to stay buried. The journal, in its final entries, mentioned a name twice. Victor. No last name. Only the initial and the context, a business partner. A man Robert had trusted. A man Robert had apparently told about the engine before anyone else. The tone in which Robert Black wrote about Victor in those last entries was quiet and controlled, the way a man writes when he is trying to stay composed about something that has broken something in him. V has made his position clear. One entry read, "He will not allow the patent to file. He says the market is not ready. I believe he has already spoken to the competitors." And then, the final entry before the hiding. "I have to make sure this cannot be taken." Victor Hale was 61 years old, and he was still in automotive technology. He ran Meridian Industrial Group, the largest private components manufacturer in the northeastern United States. He had been Robert Black's first business partner, and, for a brief period in the 1990s, the co-founder of what would have been Black Automotive. He had been at Robert Black's funeral, or rather, the memorial service held in Robert's absence, since there had been no body to bury. He had spoken at it. Daniel found a photograph of the service online. And there was Victor Hale in the front row, looking somber and appropriate, and standing close enough to a 22-year-old Evelyn to be offering comfort. He appeared at the manor on day 11. He came alone, in a single car, which was either confident or careless, and he asked for Evelyn by name at the gate. She met him in the manor's front room, and Daniel was not present for that conversation. What he knew about it he learned afterward, from the way Evelyn came to the outbuilding an hour later and stood in the doorway without speaking for a full 30 seconds before she said, with absolute control, "He offered to buy the car, any price I want to name." Daniel asked what she said to him. She looked at him flatly. "I told him the car was not for sale." That night, someone broke into the outbuilding. He'd gone back to the manor to get water and left the side door unlocked for 10 minutes. When he returned, the specialized carburetor he'd spent 6 days sourcing and $300 acquiring was in pieces on the floor. Not fallen. Broken. Specifically, deliberately broken. The primary housing cracked through in a way that rendered it unusable. Beside it, 2 of the vacuum lines he'd carefully restored were cut. Clean cuts. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at the damage, and felt something go very quiet inside him, not the quiet of defeat, but the quiet that comes just before a decision locks in. He sat down on the floor of the outbuilding with his back against the workbench and looked at what was left. The math was unambiguous. The carburetor alone would cost $400 to replace, minimum, if he could even source the same specification part again. The vacuum lines he could remake, given the right tubing and time. But his account had $37 in it. The van needed fuel. Lily needed new school shoes. The 30-day clock was at day 11, and he had just lost everything he'd built in the first week. He pulled out his phone and looked at Lily's contact photo, a picture she'd taken of herself making a face, her eyes crossed, her drawing pencil tucked behind her ear like a tiny civil engineer. He looked at it for a long time. He called the property management company the next morning and told them he needed to speak with whoever had authority over the estate's accounts. He was told there was no available account for contractor requests. He called a parts supplier in Albany that sometimes extended credit to small operations. They told him the waiting period was 30 days minimum. He called 2 former clients who owed him money, knowing before he dialed that neither would answer. They didn't. He drove to the bank branch in Caldwell, still in his work clothes, and asked to speak with a loan officer about a short-term advance against the potential settlement of a contract. The loan officer, a young man who was clearly uncomfortable, told him that without verifiable collateral, the bank had no available product that could help him. The foreclosure proceedings, he added gently, were already in motion. He drove back to the manor without stopping. He parked in the gravel drive and sat in the van for a while with the engine off. The October light was going amber in the trees. A crow landed on the fence post at the end of the drive and watched him with one obsidian eye. He thought about calling Lily. He thought about what he would say to her. He thought about Sarah, and about what Sarah would tell him right now if she could, and he knew exactly what she would say, that he had not come this far by quitting, and that the thing about impossible situations was that they were only impossible until they weren't. Evelyn found him still sitting in the van when she came out of the manor an hour later. She knocked on the passenger window. He rolled it down. She looked at him for a long moment, then opened the door and got in. For a woman who occupied every room she entered like a structural force, she sat very quietly in the passenger seat of his beat-up van. He told her what happened, all of it: the damage, the money, the bank, the foreclosure. He didn't frame it as a request for help. He just told her, the way a person tells another person the truth when they're too tired to manage it anymore. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "My father would have liked you." She didn't explain what she meant. She got out of the van, went back inside, and 40 minutes later sent one of her men to the outbuilding with an envelope. Inside was a debit card and a handwritten note. "Use what you need. We'll settle it later." The balance on the card, when he checked, was $25,000. He didn't speak to her about it that night. But when Lily came to the manor that weekend, he'd finally asked Mrs. Prentice to bring her out, needing to see her, needing the specific weight of her presence. Lily walked straight past Daniel and up to Evelyn, who was standing near the manor's front steps in her usual gray coat, and said with complete 8-year-old directness, "Are you the lady who owns the car?" Evelyn looked down at her. Something moved across her face that hadn't been there before. "I suppose I am," she said. Lily pulled her binder from her backpack and opened it to a drawing, the European-looking car with the long hood and narrow headlights. "I drew what I think it looks like," she said. "Is this close?" Evelyn took the binder. She looked at the drawing for a long moment. Her voice, when she answered, was different from any voice she'd used with Daniel. "It's very close," she said quietly. "You have a good eye." Lily beamed. Daniel, watching from across the drive, put one hand flat on the outbuilding wall and steadied himself. Then came the night Daniel found the hidden folder. It was tucked inside the back cover of the journal, sealed with aged tape, a set of documents folded very small, technical drawings mostly, but at the back of them, a single sheet of paper that was not a drawing. It was a letter, hand-typed on old thermal paper. Addressed to no one. Signed by Robert Black. It described, in plain and careful language, what Victor Hale had done. How Victor had approached 3 of Robert's largest competitors months before Robert had planned to file the patent. How Victor had taken the engine specifications given to him in confidence and used them as leverage to secure his own consulting contracts, selling the information without selling the patent itself, ensuring the technology would be suppressed rather than competed with. How Robert had discovered this, confronted Victor, and been told, without particular remorse, that the market for fuel efficiency was not the market Victor had planned to profit from. Robert had known, after that conversation, that if he filed the patent, it would be contested, buried, and that he would be destroyed in the process. He had known that Victor had too many resources and too many relationships and too little conscience. So Robert Black had done the only thing he could think to do. He had hidden the proof, hidden the car, and disappeared not to abandon his daughter, but to protect the technology long enough for the world to be ready for it. The letter ended with a sentence that Daniel read 3 times. "By the time anyone finds this, I hope it will be enough." By day 24, they had the car on stands, and the engine accessible from both sides. Evelyn had produced, from a storage unit her lawyers had finally located, 3 boxes of her father's original workshop materials, tools, spare parts, components that hadn't been touched since Robert's hands had last held them. Some of them were unusable. But some were exactly what Daniel needed, because Robert Black had built his own components and had consequently stored his own spares, and a man who makes a thing tends to make more of it than he needs, just in case. They worked together in the evenings, Evelyn and Daniel, when the day's other obligations were finished. She was precise and methodical, more comfortable than he'd expected with physical work. And she learned faster than most people he'd ever worked beside. She didn't speak much while they worked, and neither did he. There was something in the silence between them that had changed from the early days, less tension in it, more of something else, something that neither of them was prepared to name yet. On one of those evenings, she told him about being 22 and standing in the empty boardroom of her father's company, the day after he disappeared, looking at his desk and trying to understand which version of him was real. The man who had taught her to read circuit diagrams when she was 6, or the man who had apparently walked away without a word. She had spent 22 years building her answer to that question, and the answer she'd built was, people leave. She had run her company on that premise. She had kept every relationship at a particular distance because of it. She had been, in every measurable way, successful. She had not been, in any way she could privately identify, happy. Victor's second attempt was more direct. On day 26, 2 men in unmarked jackets appeared at the property's service entrance, claiming to be with a restoration company and asking to assess the vehicle for insurance purposes. The property's caretaker, recently hired on Evelyn's instruction, turned them away. But the incident made things clear. Victor knew how close they were. He had people watching. He was running out of time, and he knew it. Daniel was bringing a box of components from the storage shed to the outbuilding at 11 that night when he heard movement on the far side of the manor. He went still, the box in his arms, listening. The sound was soft and deliberate, not accidental. He set the box down, silently, and moved toward the corner of the building. One figure, already inside the fence line, moving toward the outbuilding door. Daniel covered the distance fast and got between the intruder and the door. There was a moment of contact, brief, disorganized, the kind of struggle that has nothing elegant about it, and then the figure ran, and Daniel stood in the dark, with a gashed forearm and mud on his jacket, and the box of components, still sitting 30 feet away where he'd left it, untouched. Evelyn, who had heard the noise from an upper floor, came down with a flashlight and found him under the outbuilding's work light pressing a rag against his forearm. She didn't say anything. She went inside, came back with a first aid kit, and sat down beside him on the bench. She cleaned the cut and wrapped it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before, or who dealt with all crises the same way. Without fuss, with complete attention. Her hands were steady. She tied off the bandage and held his arm for a moment, not looking at him. Then she looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a while. The October night was cold and clear and very still. Somewhere in the dark of the outbuilding, the BMW sat on its stands, nearly whole, nearly ready, almost there. There was one component left, the valve timing actuator, the heart of what made Robert Black's engine different from everything else. The piece that allowed the fuel compression ratio to operate the way it did. Every other component had been sourced, remade, or recovered from Robert's original stores. This one had none. It was unique. There was no specification in any catalog because it had never been manufactured at scale. The only place it had ever existed was in the engine of the car sitting 12 feet away, and the original had failed, seized, corroded, irretrievably locked in place sometime in the years the car had spent underground. Daniel studied the journal diagrams for 3 straight days. He borrowed a lathe from a machinist in Caldwell who owed him a favor and didn't ask questions. He worked from Robert Black's drawings, scaling and adapting, working in the small tolerances that the component required. He made 4 attempts. The first 2 were wrong. The third was close. The fourth, he knew it when he held it in his hands. It had the weight and the balance of a thing that was right. He couldn't explain how he knew. He just knew, the way a mechanic knows, the way his hands had always known things his mind was still calculating. The evening of day 29, with less than 24 hours left, Daniel installed the final component. He worked slowly and with complete focus, talking to himself under his breath, the way he always did when a job mattered, a habit Sarah had teased him about, a habit Lily had inherited. When the installation was complete, he closed the hood. He stood back and looked at the car. It had been cleaned by then, the decades of dust removed layer by layer over the course of the month, and what was underneath was extraordinary, the charcoal paint still deep and alive, the chrome still catching light, the lines of it still as precise and deliberate as the day Robert Black had last seen it. It looked like what it was, something built with love, hidden with purpose, waiting. He called Evelyn. She came to the outbuilding in 15 minutes, still in her coat. She stopped just inside the door and looked at the car and then at him. "Tomorrow," he said. She nodded. They had kept it quiet, but somehow the press knew anyway. By the morning of day 30, there were 3 news vans parked on the road outside the manor's gate, and by the time Evelyn's people set up the arrangement in the manor's large garage, a proper space, with the original BMW moved inside, under lights, there were 24 journalists and camera operators in position. The room felt like the inside of a held breath. Daniel stood beside the car's driver's door. Lily was there, standing close to him in her good coat, the one he'd ironed that morning at 6. She had her drawing binder tucked under her arm. Evelyn stood on the other side of the car, back straight, both hands at her sides. Victor Hale was in the room as well. He'd come, ostensibly, as an industry observer, invited by someone on Evelyn's public relations team who had apparently not been briefed on what was about to happen. He stood near the back. Daniel noticed him but didn't focus on him. He opened the driver's door. He sat down. The leather seat was stiff, but intact. He looked at the instrument panel, the same one that had woken up the night he'd first found the car, the same amber glow. He put his hand on the key that had been in the journal's first pages, a physical key, old and heavy, not a fob. He inserted it into the ignition. He turned it. The engine turned over once. Twice. A rough catch, a stutter. The sound of something enormous trying to remember what it was made for. And then on the third attempt, with the sound of 20 years of silence breaking at once, the engine caught. The BMW roared. Not rough, not uncertain. It roared with the full-throated authority of something that had always been capable of exactly this, and had only been waiting for someone willing to believe it. The sound filled the garage, and then continued past it, out through the walls, out into the gray October morning. Every instrument on the dashboard came alive. The engine settled into an idle that was smooth and steady, and unlike anything Daniel had heard from a machine that old, because it wasn't like anything he'd heard from any machine, new or old. It was Robert Black's sound. The sound of 20 years of suppressed possibility. The room was completely silent except for the engine. Then Lily's voice, clear and high. "Dad." She was already running. She hit him at full speed as he got out of the car, her arms around his neck, her feet leaving the ground. He held her there, one hand on the back of her head, and he could feel her shaking, or maybe he was shaking. It was impossible to tell which. He looked over her shoulder. Evelyn was standing on the far side of the car, with one hand pressed flat against the hood, feeling the vibration. Her head was down. Her shoulders moved once, twice. When she raised her face, her cheeks were wet, not dramatically, not the way grief looks in movies, just quietly and completely, the way grief looks when it's been stored for 22 years and finally has somewhere to go. The audio file appeared on the system the moment the engine came fully to life, triggered by the ignition sequence itself. Robert Black's final precaution, his final message delivered at the only moment he could guarantee the right person would hear it. It played through the car's speakers into the silent garage. And the voice that came out was older than the photograph, rougher, but recognizable as the same man, deliberate, careful, measured. Robert Black had recorded it in the days before he hid the car, knowing he might not survive what was coming, knowing that Victor's reach was longer than he could fully map. He spoke for 11 minutes. He described everything. He named Victor Hale. He described the meetings, the betrayal, the stolen specifications, the the deliberate suppression of the patent filing. He described what he had done and why. He said that he had hidden the technology not because he had lost faith in it, but because he needed it to outlast the people who wanted to bury it. He said he had hidden it in the place he trusted most, the house where Evelyn had been born, where she had grown up, the house that had been his long before it became hers to inherit. "She'll find it when she's ready," he said. "She's always been smarter than she thinks she is. She just doesn't know yet that intelligence and forgiveness aren't opposites." He said her name once, near the end. Just her name. The way a father says a name when no other word is sufficient. The room was so quiet that the engine's idle seemed to get louder as the recording ended. Evelyn had not moved from the side of the car. Her hand was still on the hood. Victor Hale, near the back of the room, had gone completely still, not the stillness of emotion, but the stillness of a man who has just understood the shape of a disaster he cannot escape. Two of Evelyn's legal team were already on their phones. The journalists had gotten everything on camera. One of Evelyn's security people moved to stand beside Victor before anyone had said anything official about it. Victor looked around the room with the careful, measuring look of someone calculating options and finding none. He did not make a scene. He had enough dignity left for that. He went quietly, which was the least dramatic exit for the most damaging exit. Evelyn turned away from the car. She walked to where Lily was still holding Daniel's hand, and she looked at them both for a moment. Then she looked only at Daniel. She said, with the particular quality of someone saying a true thing they've been withholding, "I've been angry at him for 22 years. She paused. "I think I've been angry at the wrong thing." Daniel said nothing. There wasn't anything to say that would improve on that sentence. When the chaos of the garage eventually quieted, when the journalists had their footage and the lawyers had their recordings, and Victor Hale had been escorted to a car that would take him to a very different kind of meeting, Evelyn found Daniel in the outbuilding, sitting on the same bench where she'd bandaged his arm. He had both hands around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold. Lily was sitting on the workbench beside him, drawing in her binder, her feet swinging above the floor. Evelyn sat down on the other side of Daniel. The three of them were quiet for a while. Then she said, "The $10 million. It's yours. I've had it wired." He nodded. He didn't reach for his phone to check. He already knew she was the kind of person who did what she said she would do. "What will you do with it?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment. He said, "Fix the roof first." He paused. "Pay the hospital. Pay the bank." Another pause. "There's a building on Merchant Street I've been looking at. Used to be a machine shop. Good bones. I want to open a training garage, free of charge, for anyone who wants to learn how to do what I do." He looked at the floor. "There are a lot of people who just need someone to show them." Evelyn was quiet. Then, "That's a terrible financial decision." "Yeah," he said. "I'll co-fund it," she said, as if that settled something. Maybe it did. He looked at her. She was looking at the far wall of the outbuilding, at the place where the BMW had spent 30 days of a man's most important month. The car was back in the manor's proper garage now, cleaned and documented, and about to become the subject of a legal battle that would eventually reshape 3 patent portfolios and 2 corporate structures. But that was the future's business. Right now, it was 3 people in a small building with cold coffee, and a child's drawings, and the particular silence of things that have been resolved. Lily looked up from her binder and said, without any particular preamble, in the way that children say true things, "Are you going to be around more now?" Evelyn looked at her. Her expression did that thing it had been doing more frequently, opening slightly, becoming less a wall and more a window. "I think so," she said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went back to her drawing. 6 months later, on an April evening with the sun going low and the highway empty and the Pacific shining somewhere off the shoulder of the coast road, the BMW moved through the world again for the first time in 22 years. Daniel drove. The engine made its extraordinary sound smooth, powerful. Unlike anything the road had heard before, and the charcoal paint caught the late light and gave it back as something richer. Lily was in the back seat, pressed against the window, watching the landscape go by, with the expression of someone who has arrived, finally, in a place they drew from imagination so many times that the real version feels like memory. Evelyn was in the passenger seat. She had her window down an inch, and the air came in and moved her hair, and she wasn't thinking about the company or the patent or the depositions or any of the 22 years of machinery that had brought her to this moment. She was thinking about a photograph of a man standing beside this car in summer, with rolled sleeves and a half smile that belonged to someone who had just finished something difficult. She had looked at that photograph every day since finding it. And she had stopped being angry at it weeks ago and had not yet found the right word for what she felt. Instead, something between grief and gratitude, and the particular tenderness that comes from understanding someone too late and almost not at all. She looked at Daniel. He was watching the road with both hands easy on the wheel. The way he did everything with competence and without performance. She said quietly, "I think my father hid that car in that house so that I would find it." Daniel glanced at her. She looked ahead, back at the road. "I think he knew I'd build something to fill the shape of what he left. And I think he put the car in the only place that would eventually force me to stop building long enough to open it." She was quiet for a second. "I think he hid it there for me to find. But I think I needed someone else to help me get it open." The engine hummed. From the back seat, Lily said, "This is the best car." And that was true, Daniel thought. That was exactly right. The road curved along the coast, and the last of the day's light went amber in the windshield, and the BMW carried them forward into the evening, with the ease of something that had always known where it was going, waiting only for the moment when the right people were finally inside it together. He had fixed the car. He had fixed the roof. He had opened the garage on Merchant Street, and on the first morning, 11 people had shown up who had never done anything more complex than change a tire, and he had stood in front of them and started from the beginning, the way someone had once started from the beginning with him, because that is how things get passed on, not through grand gestures, not through billions of dollars, but through the willingness to sit beside someone and say, "Let me show you how this works." He had kept every promise he'd made his daughter. He had kept the one promise he'd made Sarah, the one he'd made at the end, in the hospital room on a Thursday morning, the one he'd never said out loud because saying it would have meant she was already gone, that he would not let the life they'd built mean nothing, that Lily would grow up knowing what it felt like to have someone in her corner who would not quit, that the love of her mother would live in the way her father moved through the world steadily, honestly, with both hands always ready to be useful. The BMW moved through the April evening. Lily was still watching out the window, her binder open on her lap. She had turned to a fresh page. She was beginning to draw something new. Sometimes, the most valuable thing in the world is not what has been buried and preserved. It is not a rare machine, or a hidden patent, or the proof of someone's betrayal. Sometimes the most valuable thing is the person who shows up on the worst morning of your life with the right tools and the patience to begin. Sometimes what has been waiting in the dark is not a secret. It is a second chance, and all it ever needed was someone willing to turn the key.